Warning! This podcast is for adults only. It's simply bursting with swearing, spoilers, and salacious descriptions of shapeshifting. All opinions expressed in this episode are those of the host himself, and, most importantly, transformation of the kind discussed here isn't real. So don't go getting bitten by anything wild on our behalf.
Violet, you're turning violet, Violet!
There's no medical precedent for what's happening to you.
Puny human.
A naked American man stole my balloon.
What?
It's getting worse.
I'm getting better.
It's too late for me, but you've got to stop them.
Finally, monsieur, a waffle thin mint. Oh, sir, it's only a tiny little thin one.
Now, fuck off, I'm full.
Oh, sir.
You're gonna endanger us. You're gonna endanger our client, the nice lady who paid us in advance before she became a dog.
I will not be threatened by a walking meatloaf.
I wish I were a fish.
You chose poorly.
I've been pricking up my thumb to something wicked this way comes.
I may not know who you are, or what you're gonna be when we're done here, but you're welcome to sit a spell with the Shifty Bastards on this, the pilot episode. My name is Crafty, here to gush and guffaw about transformation wherever it grows. Now, what do I mean by transformation? There are all kinds of transformation out there. A quick internet search will show you how the word itself gets used and abused in contemporary culture. It shows up as a technical term in biology, mathematics, linguistics, logic, and physics. You'll find advertisements from those looking to transform your business, your lifestyle, or your face. In fact, if you were to hunt down lists of transformations in the media, most of them will be about makeovers. But this show isn't about going from frumpy to fashionable. Like Cinderella, she's already had her fun. We're more interested in her entourage. Those who are twisted into entirely different forms by top-shelf spell slinging, as just one of many methods. This kind of metamorphosis usually involves a human or humanoid at some stage, often because humans can sometimes be coerced into paying for their entertainment, wink wink nudge nudge. But that is assuming they have anything left after throwing their hard-earned cash at all kinds of beautifying, volumizing, shaping, scraping, and toning topicals that sometimes provide temporary cosmetic enhancement. Our quarry, however, must contain representations of dramatic physical alteration, though not necessarily permanent, a metaphor at least as old and compelling as our species' ability to spin a story. These are tethered to our collective desire to come to grips with the perpetual chaos of change that we are all forced to weather if we are to survive in the real world. For a subject that's fascinated humans since prehistory, the topic can be pretty broad. Fortunately, I've quaffed from the plasma trough enough to shrug off such tough stuff. As I lay these out, I'm going to provide some examples from a wide variety of sources. There will always be deviations and crossovers in the taxonomy of transmogrification, so this rough rundown is just to help you get your toes wet. And maybe webbed. Now, had you heeded the warning at the start of the podcast, you've likely been around at least long enough to know that growing up is hard to do. Not that we have much control over the process, mind you. The bodies we're born with start out small and appear to grow rapidly until we're toddlers, coming in fits and spurts after that, usually culminating with the last of them at puberty. The tallest human on verifiable record, Robert Pershing Wadlow, was over 8 feet 11 inches tall at the time of his death. That's 2.72 meters for my Euro peeps and Canada friends. But just because the giant of Alton, Illinois helps give us a sense of our species' basic biological limitations doesn't mean we'll likely ever stop dreaming of giants, like Apache Chief, the animated Native American stereotype from the Super Friends cartoon, made by Hanna-Barbera in the late 70s. He would use his power word, "Inukchuk," which is supposed to translate to big man, to grow as much as 50 feet tall, at least until later episodes where his growth was technically unlimited. Not only would he retain his physical appearance and proportions, his clothing would grow right along with him, earning his loincloth a spot next to the Hulk's purple capris in the Hall of Fame for magical, modesty-retaining fashion. Look a bit further down the row and you'll see a leopard print bikini with the same one-size-fits-always mojo. Giganta, an Amazonian ginger, was blowing up big in the comics before the cartoon added her to their roster as Chief's female foil. Which I see as proof that this power fantasy doesn't just belong to the boys. Amazing colossal men and 50-foot women aside, the ability to grow is more of a liability if you can't also shrink back down to a more manageable size when you're finished rampaging. Sometimes, shrinking to subatomic sizes allows you to hide in plain sight, infiltrate the most impenetrable stronghold, or even go on a fantastic voyage. However, both Ant-Man and the Atom would agree that staying small in this big bad world would convert that power fantasy into a hell in every handbasket. The black and white sci-fi film classic The Incredible Shrinking Man and its spiritual sister sequel, The Incredible Shrinking Woman, are perfect examples of the horrors of disappearing from the world you know between a crack in the floor. While the man, Scott, fought to survive pets and pests just like the woman, Pat Kramer, as played by Lily Tomlin, his story was about an ordinary businessman fending for himself like an itty-bitty Bear Grylls after he could no longer be perceived by the wife and the world he once knew. Pat Kramer's story, however, was a comedic indictment of consumerism that involved a normal housewife who rose to fame once her condition became public. As she continued to shrink, so too went her fame. The world, thinking she had died, tossed their awareness of her into the trash, along with yesterday's news, as she watches on in horror. It's safe to say, the full-body size play can get quite messy at both ends of the scale, so why not just pick your favorite physical feature and give that a boost instead? Some might be keen on having Popeye's spinach swollen extremities, or the more localized power of the almighty foot from Stephen Chow's 2013 film Journey to the West. It would also seem reasonable to equate power of the purely mechanical variety with amassing more evenly distributed muscle, and few embody the beefiest of bulk better than the Incredible Hulk. His rage-fueled transformation makes this jolly green giant stronger than any puny human bodybuilder could ever hope to be. In reality, the side effects of steroid abuse are far worse than those of Dr. Banner's gamma poisoning, which may account for the big lug's longevity in popular culture, having appeared in comics, games, TV, and movies since the early 60s. In a more moderate example of beefification, the camp-tastic 80s movie Hunk has a scene where a recently dumped computer geek gets magically pumped up by Dr. D to help our hero keep from getting sand kicked in his face anymore. Not only do his muscles swell on screen, you also get to watch his boxers bulge with the extra length and girth he gains between his legs. Hackneyed and hypersexualized as this notion of male beauty is, it's no less appealing to the media makers if the proliferation of supernatural male enhancement is any indication. While we're on the subject of tiny twigs turning into towering trees, I would be remiss if I didn't also bring up the berries. In the South Park episode Medicinal Fried Chicken, Stan's dad, Randy Marsh, finds a shortcut for obtaining a prescription for weed by bombarding his balls with microwave radiation, by literally sticking them in a microwave. This causes them to swell enough that they can ride around on them like hairy hopping balls while high on their reefer cigarettes. Metaphors for the human condition aside, this hypergonadism also provides a delightfully absurd visual. Of course, as with gigantism, extreme glandular growth is subject to the whims of our sexually dimorphic observations. There are whole websites devoted to depicting the rapid growth and expansion of breasts. Yes, I'm talking mostly about erotica, to say nothing of the proliferation of gimmicks and quackery bouncing hypnotically beyond the boundaries of legitimate medically based enhancement. The most overt example I could summon comes from the laughably heinous horror series Leprechaun. In the third installment of the film franchise, the Leprechaun tracks down a woman who spent her share of his stolen gold on plastic surgery. For retribution, he causes her breasts to inflate, followed by her lips, and finally her ass. In an attempt to flee, she gets stuck in the doorway where her assets continue to swell until she explodes. which leaves me with the most confused fear boner every time. But don't let the leprechaun deter you from finding bodily inflation fun. The 80s action comedy Big Trouble in Little China has one of the most beloved body inflation scenes in film, even though it also ends in an explosion. When Lo Pan's minion sees the corpse of his master, he becomes enraged and starts to expand all over, splitting his seams and swelling to obscene proportions. His eyes bug out as steam streams from his ears and nostrils before he explodes in a shower of fleshy bits, bringing down the house, literally, with a fantastic bit of practical effects. The wide difference in quality between Big Trouble's bursting badass and the leprechaun's lazy, slut-shaming ass-splosion is a prime example of how a potentially traumatizing visual can be bolstered by better use of latex, makeup, and pneumatics, as well as better writing. When filling the shoes of someone destined to blow up, air isn't always ideal. Violet Beauregard from Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory has been brought to the brink as a billowing blueberry on screen more than once. Her body can only take so much and must be juiced to prevent this grisly, if bubblicious, outcome. If you doubt the impact of this scene on the zeitgeist, I dare you to look up barification and blueberry girls the next time you need a rabbit hole in which to plummet. Of course, no exploration of expanding anatomy would be complete without a taste of extreme weight gain, sometimes called fat inflation. For some of us, the idea of gaining even a pound or two can be enough to give them the sweats, in part because of all the body shaming in contemporary culture. Imagine the outright trauma they would suffer to find themselves gaining weight by the second, eventually being set adrift, immobile, in an ocean of your own blubbery flesh. While common enough in sitcoms and cartoons, my favorite example comes from Monty Python's The Meaning of Life. In it, the aptly named Mr. Creosote waddles into his best local bistro for a gluttonous bacchanal that would make hedonism bot blush. After gorging himself into a surly stupor, he allows himself to be coaxed by the maitre d', played by John Cleese, into eating one last wafer-thin mint digestif, which causes him to swell up and explode, showering the busy restaurant and its patrons in viscera and partially digested vichyssoise. The last we see of Creosote is his cavernous peritoneal cavity exposed as he receives the bill for his extravagant stuffing. This kind of outright body horror, when slathered liberally with the famous Python humor, makes even the most maudlin mess palatable, if not outright enjoyable. Even if you find the idea of extreme weight gain appalling, you may be no more comforted by the idea of its opposite, extreme weight loss, or wasting. In Stephen King's Thinner, an overweight lawyer is cursed by some Romani to waste away to nothing, no matter how much he consumes. He becomes so thin and frail that he experiences drastic fatigue and looks almost like someone who's aging rapidly. This loss of vitality is a common enough fear that it can be perpetrated in a variety of ways. The notion of one's life energies being sapped or stolen comes in a variety of forms, but it's more often tied to our fear of growing weaker in our old age. Vampires and witches are often depicted preying on the living to reclaim or retain their physical youth and beauty at the expense of their victims. Often someone's quest for the proverbial fountain of youth leads to an early death, ironically. You may not know until it's too late that you chose poorly. Like the first on-screen sip from the phony grail in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. But rapid aging doesn't need to be fatal, as is the experience of one 12-year-old Josh Baskin from the Tom Hanks classic Big. Just wish on an eerie antique at the arcade, and you could wake up the next morning as a full-grown adult. How wonderful to skip past the horrors of puberty in one night! Still, retaining his 12-year-old mind ended up being a bit of a handicap, not that it kept him from getting laid. And to distract you from all the creepiest implications that arise from that little sex scene, let's turn the trope on its head and drop it squarely in the laps of the next generation. And by that, I'm referring to the crew of the USS Enterprise. In the episode Rascals, a teleporter accident leaves the core command of the ship reduced in strength and stature to their childhood selves, while retaining their adult minds. Without the strength they had in adult bodies, they're forced to use their relatively weaker forms to play hide and sneak with a group of alien invaders who've come to hijack the ship. As attractive as a fountain of youth may be, it's simply not enough for some. In an example of one of the youngest types of transformation tropes, the desire to play along the entire span of one's evolutionary path comes up more and more since Darwin penned his piece on the origin of species over 2 centuries ago. Scientists and supervillains acquired a new gimmick with the power to evolve or devolve their minions and victims. In the entertainingly awful Super Mario Bros. movie, King Koopa, as played by Dennis Hopper, has a machine that can advance someone along their evolutionary path, granting them higher intelligence and a more humanoid appearance. If one were to reverse the polarity, however, you can devolve your victim into a big dumb brute version of themselves, or even further back until they're little more than a primordial slime mold. But even when skipping down that primrose path, Koopa and his victims seemed to retain their identities. But as we all know, your identity can be stolen. Shape-shifting mutants like the blue-skinned Mystique, antagonist to Marvel's X-Men, can rapidly change her appearance to visually imitate just about any other human so perfectly as to put the greatest of quick-change artists and masters of disguise to shame. However, she may have to take a back seat to the primary protagonists from the video game series Prototype, both of whom are gifted, or cursed, with the ability to absorb and then become any human they encounter, having retained all of that individual's vital signs, clothing, equipment, and even their memories makes what Mystique can do look like a parlor trick. However, there's one aspect of her powers, the ability to bend her body into that of a different gender, for which some of us would gleefully trade everything we have. Sometimes gender shifting appears via whimsical mysticism, as in Ranma Half. This beloved anime and manga franchise revolves around the victims of the ancient cursed springs of Jusenkyo, where whoever falls in one of over 100 different pools is cursed to take the form of some long-since drowned person or animal. The victims shift when being doused in cold water, and then go back to their original bodies after coming into contact with hot water. The young man Ranma turns into a nubile redhead at the worst possible times, and has to all but scald himself to trade in his tits for a tadger. But even that is dramatically quicker, cheaper, less painful, and more complete than the gender reassignment surgery and hormone therapy of the real world. For those of us who are either unwilling or uninterested in trading in our Y for an X, or vice versa, the other cursed springs of Jusenkyo may offer new life drawn from a menagerie of soggy critters, like a duck, cat, frog, octopus, piglet, or panda. There's even a bipedal hybrid of a yeti, a bull, a crane, and an eel. But anime animorphs and kung fu pandas aside, the desire to completely, or partially, change one's species remains one of the oldest and most widespread transformational tangents in history. Before we dive into the trans-species tropes, however, let's take a break for a quick word from one of our sponsors. Why, hello there. Are you sick of the mundane? The humdrum of a workaday life? Is there something missing? Perhaps all you need is a change. A change you can find here, at the Caveat Emporium. We specialize in only the most exciting and unique paraphernalia, guaranteed to bring endless excitement into your life. Let's have a look at what's in stock. Do you yearn to run wild in the brisk midnight air without a care in the world? Why not try this dashing all-weather hoodie I call the best of Gévaudan? This one-size-fits-all masterpiece was handcrafted for King Louis XV over 2.5 centuries ago. Even still, it remains in pristine condition.
Wow! The ears and tail are so realistic they almost seem to move on their own. But what's with the flea collar?
That is a specially treated designer choker, I'll have you know, and you'd be as good as naked without it, especially during the full moon.
Hey, why is there only one bonbon in the display case?
Ah, that is the Midas Munch. Eat it, and everything that touches your tongue from then on will turn into the most impossibly decadent gourmet chocolate you've never tasted.
That seems like a pretty big price for one little chocolate.
Actually, it's technically a lifetime supply of the best possible confectionery. It also comes with a complimentary set of monogrammed, stain-proof silk handkerchiefs. as well as type 2 diabetes.
So, what's with these long johns?
Ah, you have a good eye. That's the legendary jumpsuit of justice. It grants the wearer superhuman physical prowess, immortality, and an unquenchable thirst for adventure.
Immortality? You mean that I'll live forever if I wear this?
Well, immortality of a sort. More often than not, it tends to be an early retirement with honors. Comes with a complimentary alter ego as well as the horn-rimmed glasses of anonymity.
Oh, this is that magic Mormon underwear I've heard so much about, right?
I need you to get out of my store. All this and more. Don't come to us, we'll come to you. Literally. When there's something you just can't do without, we'll be at that one spot where you're sure there wasn't a shop before. At the corner of your usual route home and that darkened alley. Here at the Caveat Emporium, you keep the change. Mostly because there are no refunds. Seriously, just try and find us again. Good luck. And welcome back to the second leg of our tumble down the rabbit hole. As we plummet past Alice into the wonderland of shape-shifting fiction and fantasy, we are likely to plunge headfirst into one of humankind's most ancient transformative desires, to take the form of one of the many amazing species of wild animal with whom we share the earth. Sometimes we want nothing more than to slough off all the trimmings and trappings of our entirely too human lives for a chance to howl at the moon without a care in the world. You may want to retain your mind, making your freedom from bills, obligations, and social mores all the sweeter. Don Knotts, as the incredible Mr. Limpet, may have wished he were a fish. But he still retained his mind, as well as the need for corrective eyewear. Without them, he could not have fulfilled his dream of helping the U.S. Navy sink Nazi U-boats during World War II. Fishy wishing aside, perhaps you'd prefer to leave behind those higher brain functions as well, allowing that most primal lizard brain to take over in full. Either way, the theme has been explored through countless tales of shaman and witches, mad scientists, and star-crossed lovers. It's not the same as imposing your mind upon some hapless critter, or even the more subtle borrowing employed by best witch ever, Granny Weatherwax, of Discworld fame. Instead, we seek shapeshifters like the star of TV's Manimal himself, Dr. Jonathan Chase. Through his amazing, nigh godlike power of having too much money, Chase acquired the ability to, supposedly, transform into any animal at will. I say supposedly because, as fantastic as the premise sounds, the good doctor only either ever turned into a hawk or a black panther in all but a handful of other instances. Though he may be master of the secrets that divide man from animal, animal from man, the producers of this manimal probably only had the budget to make him into a petting zoo's worth of different critters. Without that constraint, or perhaps with a bit more imagination on the part of the writers, how many more problems could you solve as, say, an elephant? Brute force and a prehensile trunk aside, consider the boost to your long-term memory. Although, that could just as well be a double-edged sword if it only serves to enhance the kind of PTSD experienced by Ebenezer Ebony Hyde from the Image comic Elephant Men. This leads us to consider the elephant in the room, the way in which becoming an animal could be a detriment. On the tarnished side of that particular denarius, we find the pair of cruelly cursed paramours from the 1985 film Ladyhawke. When a spurned bishop makes a demonic pact to satisfy his jealous rage over being spurned by the beautiful Isabeau, played by Michelle Pfeiffer, he sentences her to take the form of a hawk during the day, while Etienne, played by Rutger Hauer, the man she loves and has already married in secret, is cursed to become a wolf at night. Here, the freedom imparted by the ability to change into a powerful predator or a soaring bird of prey has just enough conditions to make it more torture than treasure. Also, if you don't already know what a denarius is, you need to read more Dresden Files. Resourceful beings that we humans are, some of us are such hopeful optimists that they would happily take on such a supernatural burden. This brings us to the plight of the ever-ubiquitous werewolf. Depending on the flavor of their particular curse, they may not be able to control when they transform, or may be easily detected even in human form thanks to hairy palms or arcane scars. These detriments are usually offset by the overwhelming physical power that accompanies the affliction, at least until the beast accidentally kills someone the human host cares for deeply. Sometimes they are depicted as humans who became wolves, as in the broadly panned flick Blood and Chocolate. The transformation effects are tragically anticlimactic slow-motion fades where a human goes into a colorful smudge and a wolf comes out the other end. Worse still, they are subject to many of the same social tethers from which they should have freedom, what I consider a side effect of the very human need for a social support structure. Seriously, what's the point of being a badass beastie if you still have to deal with trauma? Even the Underworld film franchise, a hasty knockoff of White Wolf's World of Darkness, and the unintentionally hilarious Howling movies suffer from more drama than any humanimal deserves. Where the curse of the werewolf really shines as a poignant metaphor, however, is when it's used to illustrate the potential horrors that permeate the experience we all call coming of age. In An American Werewolf in London, and a little more overtly in the horrible Parisian sequel, David, a backpacker and barely mature Yank, survives an attack that curses him to change into a ravenous beast nightly. Here, culture shock and burgeoning romance are the ever-present companions to David's tragic experiences abroad. Without the tragedy invited by insatiable bloodlust and a lack of human mind in one's beast form, this theme becomes more palatable for campy comedy and Saturday morning cartoons, as with the far less violent Teen Wolf franchise. While puberty rarely makes us more confident in our abilities, awkward nerd and aspiring basketball player Scott Howard, originally played by Michael J. Fox, manages to make it work for him with some loving support from his coach, friends, and family. This doesn't really detract from the poignancy of the underlying metaphor, but it's still heavily weighted towards the male experience of maturation. The shock of getting bigger, hairier, and stronger can pale in comparison to the first time a woman gets her period, which itself has even been colloquially referred to as the curse. The Ginger Snaps franchise addresses this notion directly, as Ginger Fitzgerald is attacked by a werewolf during her first menstrual cycle. From that point on, she becomes hairier and more aggressive, and even transmits the condition, through unprotected sex, to a classmate named Jason. Sex and puberty, blood and violence, are all fodder for the werewolf metaphor at its most horrifyingly relatable. Of course, werewolves are far from the only creature we've dreamed of becoming or feared forced transformation into. Following the theme of sexual awakening, the erotic horror film Cat People features a cursed bloodline of people who can't copulate without turning into a black panther, unless their partner is another with the same curse. The only way to regain their human shape is to kill someone, thus providing a deadly quandary for the person trapped inside the quadruped. You can maintain a life of celibacy if you wish to stay human. You can enjoy a one-night fling before spending the rest of your days in a zoo. You could also break the incest taboo by taking someone in your cursed family as a partner, which even I'd be willing to entertain if my siblings were Malcolm McDowell or Natasha Kinski. Or finally, you can fuck and flay your way to a life of bloody freedom by breaking the taboo of murder. On the less sexy side, for anyone who's never been a lonely shepherd or played Settlers of Catan, the horror comedy Black Sheep, not the one with Chris Farley, features a woolly herd of genetically engineered man-eating ruminants that convert their human victims into violent, undead ungulates. In the world of American comics, DC's Batman faces down the many iterations of the Man-Bat. Originally a scientist, Dr. Kirk Langstrom tried to regain his congenital loss of hearing by injecting himself with a serum designed to give a bat's sonar sense to humans. This, of course, turned him into a man-sized bat monster until Batman could revert this transformation with the antidote. This is also similar to Spider-Man's nemesis and erstwhile mentor, the Lizard, from the Marvel Universe. Genetic biologist Dr. Connors designed a serum meant to regrow lost limbs, especially his own missing right arm. Upon using it on himself, he grew back his missing arm, but also transformed into a rampaging reptile, his once brilliant mind overcome by the ever-present lizard brain that drives our own instincts. However humanistic the motivations for their scientific advances, these cautionary tales in bioethics make some delightfully frightening origin stories for some of our favorite monsters and villains simply by putting a slightly more modern spin on the tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Few of these hybrid horrors are more memorable than the film franchise The Fly. Whether you're swatting at the 3 movies from the 50s and 60s with Vincent Price, or the 2 more recent entries, the notion of human-animal hybridization and technological progress butts against the same underlying moral message. You can't penetrate beyond society's sick gray fear of the flesh. Drink deep or taste not the plasma spring. To quote Jeff Goldblum as Seth Brundle in director David Cronenberg's viscerally amazing 1986 remake. Since merging an insect with a human evokes much of the same feelings of pestilence and disgust, you might be forgiven for thinking it turns one into an entity entirely alien in nature. But even when extraterrestrial technology is the phlebotomy that merges man and animal, the resulting beastly biped is not always so strange as to no longer be human at some level. The Guyver franchise of movies, manga, and anime, called Mutronics in Europe, features humans enhanced by alien technology called Zoolords. Along with unnatural longevity, this tampering granted them the ability to swap into and out of ridiculously powerful and fugly hybrid forms that are loosely based on various terrestrial animals. They retain their human minds, but tend to behave like overambitious warlords or thuggish adrenaline junkies, which fits into our commonly held notion of the corruptive influence of power. By contrast, the film District 9 shows us the transformation of bureaucratic everyman Wickus Vandermeer into one of the socially downtrodden extraterrestrial prawns for whom he once lacked nearly any kind of objective compassion. With the onset of his change, he is spurned by his co-workers, friends, family, and ultimately, society as a whole. His mind is trapped in a body society seems incapable of seeing as anything other than completely alien, and not the cute Reese's Pieces munching kind of E.T. either. However, instead of becoming the monster the public considers him to be as he mutates, he is refined into someone with more humanity, if we assume humanity to be an aspect of empathic understanding. In this way, District 9 conveys a similar socially relevant message to that of Black Like Me. It just happens to have a lot more aliens and missile-launching mechs and explosions. And I ain't mad at that. In spite of the horrific and violence-strewn nature of Wickus's fall from human society, he still retains his sense of identity. In John Carpenter's The Thing, an alien parasite infects and assimilates most of the warm-blooded occupants of an isolated research station in the Antarctic. The organism is able to perfectly imitate its victims, leading to a chillingly paranoia-infused witch hunt for an alien monster that acts exactly like a human. The anime and manga Parasite, with a Y, features a similar device where carnivorous worms of unknown origin fall to Earth one night. The least fortunate victims have their heads consumed and replaced by the organism, leaving behind a human body controlled by a seemingly alien entity that can shift the shape of their head into anything from other people to a variety of bladed tendrils and slavering toothy maws. This is where the identity paranoia and grotesque shape-shifting of The Thing finds a frightening foothold amidst the whole of human society rather than one isolated frozen grotto. Tangentially, the messy mincemeat murderers of Parasite play on our need to feel like we're living amongst others of our kind. But there is such a thing as being too close for comfort. We often prize our individuality to such a degree that the idea of losing it to a greater whole grants its own kind of terror. Cult classics like The Blob and The Stuff tinker with this trope, where the blob simply absorbs and dissolves your body to make more of itself. The stuff consumes your individuality while leaving your body intact, if a bit mushy. The 1989 sci-fi flick Leviathan depicts the slow mutation and assimilation of a crew of undersea geologists who are afflicted with a contagion that turns them into a bloodthirsty pile of tentacles, the moaning faces of those who make up the beast still visible around its body. Riffing on these themes with a humorous twist, the Nathan Fillion flick Slither features an evil little extraterrestrial parasite that infects its first victim, taking over his consciousness and memories. From then on, he proceeds to absorb other people in the area into a viscerally viscous heap of merged flesh, possessed of a hungry hive mind. The idea of losing one's individuality, free will, or identity is something we clearly find appalling, whether it's taken from you by a slavering mass of goo, alien parasites, or even a sexy mutant polymorph like Mystique. Speaking of polymorphs, some won't just steal your identity, they'll also steal part of your personality. In Season 3, Episode 3 of the BBC sci-fi comedy series Red Dwarf, one such shapeshifter sups on the vanity, fear, guilt, and rage of the crew, reducing each one to an emotionally crippled parody of themselves. Even Crichton, the resident mechanoid butler and science officer, has his positronic personality purged of guilt amidst the chaos. The polymorph responsible is a psychic, genetically engineered monster that can instantly assume a variety of shapes to lure its prey close enough to feed after exacerbating their emotional state. Psyche sucking aside, the polymorph's power to turn into inanimate objects reveals the final facet of this exploration into physical change. The word objectification takes on entirely new nuance when you see how much media features people being frozen or petrified, called statuification in some circles, as well as being converted into surgically fashioned cyborgs like RoboCop. Murphy would likely experience serious pangs of jealousy deep down in his mechanical heart if he had a chance to regain his human form like some other fictional robots out there. The aforementioned Crichton of Red Dwarf once found himself atomically reconstructed into a human form, ultimately finding the whole experience of being organic rather messy, confusing, and inconvenient. Bender Bending Rodriguez from Futurama also undergoes a similar procedure at one point, playfully called reverse fossilization by Professor Farnsworth. His take on the experience is entirely different from Crichton's, however, as Bender becomes utterly subservient to his most hedonistic whims, eventually becoming an obese mountain of blubber over the course of a week. A side effect of not having realized tasting stuff tasted so good. Even becoming decorations, toys, trinkets, and other objects comes up in a variety of media, often as a form of punishment or cold storage. In Disney's Return to Oz, the Gnome King, an entity made of stone, appears more human for every living being that is magically turned into a decorative curio for his collection. Inversely, the little wooden marionette Pinocchio is granted life by a wish, but doesn't become flesh and blood until he completes his own journey of self-discovery. Similarly, the Camptastic Mannequin movies feature people that find themselves cursed to take the form of a plastic mannequin, only able to return to animate life under certain conditions. There's even a children's television series with a similar premise, Today's Special, where a mannequin named Jeff can only come to life if someone says "Hocus Pocus Alamagocus" while he's wearing his magic hat. Of course, the most widely known story of people being turned into statues stem from the mythological monster Medusa, whose gaze would petrify you where you stood. But being bodily converted into stone, ice, or any other material may not necessarily spell your demise in popular fiction. Elementals of all varieties permeate our collective imagination, whether they're fighting for righteous causes or are simply steeped in villainous violence. Some of my most memorable elemental heroes come from the pages of comics, and there are so many I'm going to stick with the Marvel Universe. The X-Men employed exothermic mutant Iceman, born Bobby Drake, to freeze foes solid while sliding around on a snaking ice flume that looks like more fun than anyone deserves to have. His antithesis, though no less heroic, is the Fantastic Four's Human Torch. When former test pilot Johnny Storm is exposed to cosmic radiation, his entire body has the ability to become engulfed in flames without somehow burning him to a crisp. Less fortunate of the four is the Torch's clobber-happy chum, the Thing. Ben Grimm could just as easily be considered an earth or stone elemental, his body being converted permanently into a craggy orange mass that tends to alienate him from society in spite of his heroic intentions. It's easy to see how Ben could join the dark side of elemental entities with enough impetus. He could join Spider-Man's supervillain, Sandman, whose body is composed of silicate particulate due to an accident that left him with a much more complete grab bag of earthy powers compared to the Thing. Less grounded is another of Spider-Man's nemeses, Electro, whose electrokinetic powers at one point allow him to become a living lightning bolt. There are so many other examples of characters that physically embody elements that I've got no choice but to walk away from the subject if we're ever going to reach the bottom of this rabbit hole. And there you have it, the meat of the matter. I could talk about the methods of transformation used, but even when the resulting critter is the same, the means of mutation would be executed in 1,000 different ways. I'm looking at you, werewolves. It could be based on who's at the creative helm, or simply how much money they have left over after hookers and blow. I'm looking at you, Hollywood. There are so many crossovers between that pinning down all but the most overt examples might as well be the 13th labor of Heracles. Carpenter's The Thing depicts a human head surviving decapitation along with the body, Herbert West style. It's alien in origin, but organically human in execution. Then, the head sprouts legs and skitters away. What do you even call that? Autonomous transformation? Nightbreed shows people exhaling a few lungfuls of smoke from what I'm sure must be the stickiest of the icky. Next thing you know, they're more pale, got their teeth sharpened, and popped in a new set of cosmetic lenses. Sometimes there's just stuff on their face. What do you call that? Uglification? Dankification? Now, as long as you don't mind the imposition, this is where you might be able to help. If you come up with a great name for the kind of transformation found in your favorite mutated media, you should tweet it at Shifty Bastards. We'll also happily take your suggestions for media that fits this mold, even if a little dribbles over the edge or skitters away. As but one man, I can only play so many video games, read so many comics, and watch so much of screen and stage. I need your help in finding those hidden gems, as well as the cornea-searing bombs that are our bread and butter. Just remember, the only limits on what the Shifty Bastards can bring you come from the time it takes to pore over it enough for an entertaining review, and our access to the material, cost, format, language, etc. Also, I'm not afraid of tackling something in another language. Just make sure it at least has subtitles and available translation, or even just some pictures. I can't read kanji, but you wouldn't know it to look at my manga collection. And if you're usually a human who appreciates this kind of bawdy horror enough to throw your hard-earned quatloos down our completely consensual money hole, you can also patronize us at patreon.com/shiftybastards. You'll be cursed to become one of our privileged patrons, getting all the latest updates, early episodes, outtakes, and much, much more. It'll change you in ways you can't yet fathom. If that isn't you, then don't be afraid to retweet us or throw down some 5-star reviews anywhere you find the show. And that's it for the pilot episode of the Shifty Bastards podcast. Thanks to patron prime Afrodeutsch for all of her support in giving this podcast wings. Thanks to my infinitely patient mate and future guest host, Lady Yaga, who played the customer in the commercial. The music used in this episode was Summon the Rock by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com and was licensed under Creative Commons before being callously cut and crimped by myself, Crafty. If you want to get in touch with this shifty bastard to correct my vocabulary, gush about your favorite transformation media, or scold me for my scandalous emissions, I encourage you to tweet at Shifty Bastards on Twitter. Or you can tweet elsewhere, I might hear it, if you're feeling whimsical or have been turned into a nightingale. In the next episode of Shifty Bastards, the snark to my boojum, Lady Yaga, and I will discuss the walrus and his carpenter as we break down Kevin Smith's delightful horror comedy, Tusk. So, until the 1st of next month, this is Crafty, signing off and reminding you to stay shifty. The preceding podcast was a production of Meteor Press, LLC. Copyright 2017. All rights reserved.